Welcome to today's panel, where we'll be discussing corporate social responsibility and its more prominent component, ESG, or environmental, social, and governance. My name is Joe Diaz. I'm a managing partner at Lytham Partners. Metrics surrounding CSR and ESG performance are increasingly being considered by institutional investors in making investment decisions. This has largely been the province of Fortune 500 and mega cap companies. We are now starting to see institutional investors asking the same questions to mid and small cap companies. Joining us for this discussion is an expert in the field, Jamie Bechtel, founder and CEO of Keto Impact. Keto Impact transforms small and medium-sized businesses, unlocking the potential of people and organizations to simultaneously drive social and environmental good, increase profits, and mitigate risk. Keto Impact brings decades of experience to the table with expertise in business strategy, cross-sectoral collaboration, innovative partnership development, and lasting impact to deliver the appropriate CSR and ESG metrics institutional investors seek. Jamie, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
Let's start with a really basic question. What is corporate social responsibility, or CSR, and what is ESG, and why are they important?
So, corporate social responsibility has been around for a while, and it's been in the warm, fuzzy space for a long time. So as early as the 80s, companies were really struggling with, is our job for shareholders to make money, or is there more that we can do with that work and with our work? And really, in the 80s, issues like the Exxon Valdez kind of prompted and drove corporate responsibility in a new direction. But for the last 20, 30 years, it's been the companies themselves that have been driving CSR, implementing it, integrating it, and they've been finding wins. Increasingly, there's been demand driving CSR, and as demand has grown, a need to metric CSR has emerged. And ESG is really that metricing process for CSR. And so CSR is arguably the bigger umbrella, and ESG is how we measure how well that umbrella is performing.
I see. And as it relates to investors and in their and specifically institutional investors and their decision-making processes, why has this become more important to them recently?
Yeah, it's been really an exciting time, Joe, on multiple fronts, and a very dynamic time. Things are transitioning very, very quickly. The biggest concern or focus for institutional investors is managing risks. They know that companies who are addressing ESG are providing a foundation to respond to those risks. And those risks and this last year has been very enlightening. Those risks can come fast. There can be multiple risks in the same year. So last year we saw climate change, we saw diversity and inclusion pop up in a big way. There's also the need, the interest in long-term financial returns. So investors know that companies who are investing or spending time on ESG are going to be there for the long term. And so we saw very early on the Fortune 500s, the Fortune 1000s. Look, all of these people working in these businesses, and I know many of them are good people. But ultimately, the reasons big companies are making big commitments to ESG is because it's good for their sustainability. Mars, for example, has committed $1 billion to resiliency in their supply chains. It's because they want cocoa and coffee, right? And so it's very good for business, and investors know that. Investors also are responding to growing client demand, and that has been perhaps the biggest change in the last 2 or 3 years. And so we are seeing very rapid changes, we're seeing them well down into the supply chains and well down into the smaller companies. A great example is, I'm sure you heard, Joe, the ExxonMobil decision a couple of weeks ago where board members were ousted. And bear in mind, that was with that transition was with the help of BlackRock and Vanguard. They were instrumental players in changing that board. And they cited long-term shareholder value. They felt that compared to their peers, ExxonMobil was not doing enough to move forward to clean energy, and that would ultimately jeopardize the company in the next 20 to 30 years.
Yeah, you mentioned BlackRock. Larry Fink, who's the head of the firm, has really taken a very prominent role in the ESG movement and their commitment to it. What's the sense of how far down in terms of the market cap chain we may be looking at? Obviously, ExxonMobil, these are huge companies, but now we're talking about much smaller companies in the world in which we operate. How far down does Larry's influence lead to making this a really important factor in the small cap world?
It's a great question. And I did some research a couple of weeks ago that I myself found surprising. I've been working in ESG in some form or another for about 20 years. And I looked at MSCI's evaluations, and they've gone all the way down to and assessed a $2.9 million cap company.
Wow, that's pretty small.
It's pretty small. Nobody's, we actually say, I used to 2 years ago argue that, you should future-proof your company. And it's no longer about future-proofing companies. It's here and now. And so the evaluations are going all the way down to the smallest companies. But also what's happening is those big players have been at it a while, and it's hard to innovate in the space. And so they're pushing into their supply chain as a way to innovate. And a lot of companies in the supply chain, as you know, Joe, are smaller, and they're feeling this pressure from their customers. And that is going to go all the way down, not only to small companies here in the United States, but small companies in developing world as well. So everyone is, it's time to get versed in ESG, basically.
And I think that the supply chain idea is very important. These big mega companies, they've got a lot of staying power. They've got a lot of resources to be able to talk to their supply chains and tell them to live up to whatever standards they've determined need to be lived up to. But when it comes to the smaller companies, they too have supply chains, but I don't think that they're in a position to really dictate or to influence how difficult will that be for smaller companies going forward in terms of getting those supply chains to quote unquote clean up their acts if they have to.
So the small companies, the small and mid-cap companies, there are a few steps before you get to your supply chain. Having said that, human trafficking is a great example of where it's a narrow and narrower scope of time where if you should look to eliminate human trafficking in your supply chain. California already has some legislation on that. The EU has some legislation on that. So there's definitely some regulation driving supply chain cleanup, no matter what size company you're at. So let's be clear about that. But a lot of times, once you start your ESG programming, I look at it much like the climate change community does as scope 1, 2, and 3. What's the stuff we can do here and now? What's the stuff we can do with a little bit of investment? And then what's the stuff we really start to need, to be thinking about? So carbon emissions in your supply chain, that's a little ways out for small and mid-cap companies. Carbon emissions in your operations, a little bit closer to home, a little bit more here and now. So depending on the topic, depending on the issue, the supply chain, addressing the supply chain issues is still a few years out. The important thing is to get started on the things that you can immediately control and to begin to build that knowledge base so that internal stakeholders know when and where and how to act.
Sure. And let's kind of leverage off of that as it relates to the smaller companies. What is the advantage for them to be engaging and to make a commitment to ESG for these smaller companies? What's the upside for them as far as they're concerned?
It's a great question. And, even in the last few weeks, it's arguably almost the flip side of that coin, and that it's now disadvantageous not to get involved. But in terms of advantages, talent acquisition and retention, cost savings, both with HR and other issues such as your energy costs, your water costs, your regulatory or risk mitigation costs. Let's be straight, law fees, right? And then there's other opportunities down the road. So a lot of small companies are growing and looking at acquisition. They're looking at mergers. They're looking at partnering. And all of those partners are going to be asking about ESG. And different components sometimes of ESG. So Goldman Sachs, for example, has made a commitment to not take any companies public if they don't have a certain diversity set on their board. So we'll start to see more and more constraints. And what you don't want to do is, have core business operations be moving along without problem. And then all of a sudden, the ESG that didn't grow with the company be a barrier to future opportunity.
You touched on it a minute or two ago in terms of investment that these companies may have to make. From your perspective, having been involved in this space for a couple of decades, for a smaller company, what kind of a financial commitment do they need to make to ESG and to make it work for them? Because I think that's probably one of the bigger fears that they have. What's this going to cost us?
And Joe, that question is really important to me, both personally and professionally, because for a long time, look, I was there when Walmart started its ESG CSR program, 20 odd years ago. And it's expensive. It has been very expensive for companies. And to me, as somebody who's been in the space, I began to see it as a very exclusive, expensive, elusive place to be. And so we formed our company exactly to tackle that problem, to make it more accessible to more businesses. So let me give you an example. Historically, consultants would come in and do a materiality analysis, and they would charge $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 to kind of tell you what your ESG risks are. But there's enough data out there that that's no longer necessary. And I could get in trouble for saying that, I imagine. But there's enough data that we know if you're in technology, if you're in pharmaceuticals, we know what your ESG risks are. So let's just start working on them. Let's not charge the $80,000. Let's get to the low-hanging fruit. And let's start moving forward, getting some foundation there. And the smaller issues, we'll tease those out as we go along. So historically, it's been quite expensive, but with firms like Keto coming along, the idea has been to reduce that cost substantially. So we look at, for example, retainers that are between $2,000 and $7,000 a month, depending on the size of the company and just depending on the speed that they need to move at. We also do deliverable-based products, but the idea is, how do we get in, fix what needs to be fixed, give you what you need to go forward with the business, respond to your customers immediately, respond to the outside pressures you're getting, and then build the fundamentals in a way that is true to your company's growth and needs, so that you don't have a consultant parachuting in that you just wrote a check for $100,000 and you're freaking out because all of a sudden you got to get your values worth. Slow and steady is the way to do this. And one of the important things I want to point out, and I think we may get to this, so I might be jumping the gun here, Joe, but when you have a solid ESG foundation and you do this slow and steady, for example, 100% of our clients did not need to respond last summer to the Black Lives Matter issues because they were already in place. They did not need to respond to the climate change push that came because we had already had those fundamentals in place. So the idea is E, S, and G kind of go in and out of vogue, and there's those headlines, but we want to make sure you're prepared for the trend lines and that there is no volatility in your ESG system. So it has historically been very expensive. We've been really focused, and the partners that we collaborate with, on bringing that cost way down and making ESG accessible to many more companies.
Yeah. I think it's fascinating what you just mentioned about headlines, things that are in vogue, things that are just trending and everybody's talking about. As it relates to those headlines, we know that there are a number of advisory firms that collect this ESG data and other data, ISS, Glass Lewis, Morningstar, Sustainalytics, to name a few. How tuned in are they to those headlines? Because in many cases, those headlines can be a bit transitory, could be short in nature. How do they react to those sorts of situations when they crop up?
Not directly too much. They all have a algorithm. They stick to that algorithm, with the exception that as those headlines pop up, there may be more investigation, customer interest, investor interest in weaknesses in a company. That might drive those weaknesses into the headlines. And all of the let's call them accreditation companies, do look at headlines. So if you're in the news for something negative, that will come up in the screening. So it just happens that as these transitions happen and as the sort of spotlight shifts, if you will, reporters tend to look at those things more. Write articles. Those articles do get picked up by the agencies. But for the most part, they have a set of fundamentals that they want to see.
Right. And again, as it relates to these data aggregators, ISS, Glass Lewis, Morningstar, et cetera, do they collect data pretty much the same way, or do they have different areas of focus that is important to them individually? Can you touch on that just a bit?
Yeah, so for the most part, they're pretty similar. And that's something that we're very careful with our clients. We make sure they are propped up for all of the agencies. I almost think about it like credit reporting agencies, where the mitigation is very similar for all three. Mm-hmm. So they might weight a little differently. They might have different things that they look at for different sectors, but for the most part, you fix one, you fix all of them.
Sure. A few minutes ago, you used the term low-hanging fruit. As it relates to data, to disclosure of data, what are the best things and the easiest things for most of these companies to be able to put into their disclosures so that the rating agency or the advisory agencies can review them and add them to their reports? How do you feel about that?
So most companies, especially publicly traded companies here in the United States, are going to perform fairly well on multiple fronts, particularly the governance issues, where you have to remember that this is a global playing field. And so if you're a multinational company, your supply chain relies heavily on international high-risk countries, for example, it might be a little different. But for the most part, day-to-day operations, a lot of companies here in the U.S. do treat their employees very well. And those things can be disclosed in an organized fashion and really start setting a good foundation. Then there are some things that can be disclosed, whether it's diversity, for example, that maybe it's not where it should be in your company, but once you've disclosed it, that's a huge step. Take Levi's, for example. They've been doing some form of corporate responsibility for decades, and they just disclosed their diversity data. That's a very, very important first step. And maybe the numbers don't look great, but now you're at least on the playing field, and that is viewed very positively.
Yeah.
So there are some issues, and more complicated things, Joe, like climate change, where we do have these rather extensive emission um, uh, assessments to do. But frankly, scope 1 and scope 2 assessments are fairly straightforward. And so you do have something positive to say in climate related issues fairly quickly. So it's you can come up to speed, in less than a year for sure, and get what you need out there so that then you can begin planning for the medium and long term. And I just want to touch on one more thing here. The fun part about ESG, if anybody could think about it as fun at this point, is a lot of businesses, their core business offering are really important, and that matters. So whether you're a paint store that donates paint to shelters for kids to make in a more hospital shelter, whether you have a product that will get pesticides off the farms. There's so many different products. Climate change, adaptive seeds, for example. There's so many things that when you have a core business offering that matters, that is tremendous. And being able to word that properly and get that out into the space and help people understand the full range of solutions that the company is bringing to the table. That's where it gets to be interesting. What differentiates your company from all the others?
So let's talk about that, because I think it's interesting. Disclosure and the modes of disclosure. But what are the ways for a mid-cap, small-cap company to do it? What's the best way for them to put out there into the world what their policies are and how they operate? How would you advise a company in that regard?
So there's a couple of things. The first is your website and having an ESG specific space. And some of that material will be redundant with your proxy statement, with your already disclosed investor relations statements, but it's important to house it in an ESG section because it makes it easy for the folks analyzing the ESG components to find it. So the website. The second is managing the press around it, managing the investor relations dialogue around it, because the accrediting companies do look toward what's publicly available in terms of press, external reviews, that sort of thing. And then a CSR, the only reason I'm hesitating, Joe, is because this is very much in transition, and I'd like to explain just a little bit why. So historically, everybody's familiar with the CSR report, and it's, Nike's is however 100 and some pages long. And what we're learning is investors like to see that, customers like to see that, but they're not necessarily going to read it all. That's the first thing. And so there is a transition right now in readouts of CSR successes. And that looks different on social media, that looks different on how it's going into the press. But because this is now becoming a metric process under the ESG strategies, or ESG frameworks is a better word, there is a need for real data. And so, for example, there's the GRI data framework. So if you look at Nike, if you look at Adobe, if you look at some of these bigger companies, there are CSR reports, and you scroll down to the bottom, there is what's called a GRI framework, or a GRI reporting, and that's where the actual data comes in. And this is in transition right now, because for a long time, frankly, again, this was pretty touchy-feely stuff, where it was marketing. And there is a demand to move toward real, genuine change. So real, genuine, authentic, slow change is better than marketing and is better than no change. And so it is a bit of dynamic time for how the CSR reports look, how long they are, but there is definitely a trend toward rigor. So you still got the marketing piece, you still want that, but you definitely want the data on the backside.
I think part of what I heard, and I'm throwing my own interpretation into it, is make it easy for the advisory firms to find your information. Do it, yes. Do it in your filings, do it on your website, do it in your proxies, and any other way that you can get that information out so that people at the advisory firms can find it, because that's what they're doing. They're looking for it essentially online. Am I correct in that regard?
Yeah, yes, and that's a key part. And we spend a lot of time, our analysts spend a lot of time pulling that data on behalf of our clients, organizing that data, because there's multiple spaces where you have to report. You have to, you want folks to have your GRI data, you want them to have your SASB data, you want the regulators to be, easy to get the information that they need. And so you're going to have multiple places where you need to report it, but it is a very straightforward organizational process. And you nailed it. It's how to make it easy for these folks, because it's somebody who's going around checking hundreds of boxes on behalf of your company. And you just, if you could, you'd want to buy them a cup of coffee at the beginning of the day, because they're going to be at their desk all day looking at your materials. So that's why, for example, when I mentioned, have an ESG space on your website, because that researcher is going to click on that space and hopefully just be able to check off literally hundreds of boxes that he or she needs to go through every day.
So if, again, a mid-cap, small-cap company, if they're diligent about getting their disclosures out in all the various forms that they utilize, SEC filings, the website, proxies, any other thing, that is the low-hanging fruit for them, is it not?
Absolutely. And understanding those disclosures, understanding what happens, when you come across a disclosure that maybe isn't where you would like it to be, how to mitigate that very quickly. But the first step is getting the information out there in an organized fashion. And it can really transform, much less like, let's go back to that credit rating. We've all had that, credit rating that's not even my bill. How did that get on there, right? And so cleaning up your ESG rating, there's a big, easy first step that can be taken for any company.
Sure. Let's talk about management, board of director participation in these initiatives. How important is that? Is there a danger of making disclosures and not really following up on them, and that there isn't anybody who is to be held accountable in that regard? How would you respond to that?
Yes, this is something that is also changing fairly rapidly. And the next phase you're going to hear about is the audit. And we are already seeing sort of the organization of these accreditation agencies around audit. And so there will be a point in time where your ESG data is auditable. And we work really hard to make sure that process, it's a little bit like TurboTax, right? If you get audited, we're there for you because somebody has to be. But this is new. This is absolutely new. And it's moving faster in Europe, and it's moving faster on certain things. But if you asked me as a practitioner 20 years ago if companies would be audited on their disclosures around climate change, I would have laughed and had a margarita. It's just, some of this change is so incredible. And look, as much as it's irritating for all of us as we watch some of the impacts around the world in real time, it's necessary, but it's painfully necessary. And so that coming back to your question, the ability to speak to the board, the ability, you have to disclose where ESG sits in your company. You have to disclose if the board holds ultimate responsibility for it. That's part of your disclosure process. So yeah, that's a big place. And we're now seeing companies, and in fact, I'm on the board of a company as their ESG seat, so that it goes right up to the board with somebody who can assess it properly.
Right. With regards to your firm, Keto Impact, tell us a little bit about the firm. What's your mission? Obviously, you do work with public companies. Do you work with private companies? What is your reason for existence?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And I've hinted at it, I think, throughout the course of our conversation. And thank you so much for the opportunity to bring, our mission to your viewers, because it's important for business, and it's also it's good, important work generally. And our company essentially was built to help bring ESG accessibility to small and micro and mid-sized companies, and it really is becoming a have and have not sort of situation. Companies that can afford ESG are benefiting from it, and that it's making the businesses stronger. And so you have companies that are in a different place in their trajectory that don't have access because of the cost, because of the exclusivity. A quick example, we do work with private companies, and one of the CEOs at my private company 2 years ago did not know what the words, acronym CSR was, did not know what the acronym ESG was, and he called me about 6 months ago, and he was just elated. He had given a presentation at Green Biz, and he felt like he belonged. He felt like the company belonged, and now they have just made a commitment that 100% of their IP and their R&D will be in the sustainability space. So they have really transformed their whole company very quickly in 2 years. They have already seen all the benefits, and that's what we do. That's why we're here, is to bring those wins to any company. We kind of think of ourselves as, we work for business office space. We're sort of the WeWork of the Chief Impact Officer. We want to bring that top talent and that know-how to companies that should not falter because they can't afford to play at the table.
Well, we've got a couple of minutes here. Let's wrap up. But I think that I wanted to focus on, this is a broad topic, but I think that part of what you do, and certainly part of what we would want to do working with clients, is to help to mitigate that fear of what ESG is and the impact that it could have. What's your advice to small companies, mid-cap companies? They're not going to go broke doing this, and I think that there's some fear in that, and I would like to alleviate some of that here in our final minute.
Yeah, absolutely. This is very accessible. It's very doable. And I know because of the supply chain dynamics, folks are starting to get letters, tell us about your climate change, tell us about your diversity, tell us about your packaging. And those letters are piling up. They're starting to get inquiries from partners, to understand the to disclose corporate social responsibility context. I don't want to say it's easy. It's absolutely doable. It's absolutely cost effective. And it's great to see the rewards come in because you have, when you are able to hire talent who, millennials, young people now are really demanding this. And when you start to see the results, the sort of aha moments are accessible to all of us. So don't panic. There's help, and there's light at the end of the tunnel, and it's not a very long tunnel at all.
Well, Jamie, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate your insights, and I think this has been a very valuable conversation for a lot of people out there. For all of you in the public company space, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to call me or to email me, and we can get Jamie on the line if we need to do so. You can reach me, Joe Diaz, at Lytham Partners. My direct line is 602-717-7804, and you can reach me via email at Diaz, D-I-A-Z, at lythampartners.com. That's Lytham partners.com, Diaz at lythampartners.com. Jamie, thank you so much for your time, and we hope everybody in the audience really got something out of this. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks, Joe.